And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am super excited to have Christine Ma-Kellams on
Mhm.
the show with me. Let me get her book here in the frame. She has a brand new book called Band, and it's not an overly thick book, but let me tell you what, this book is dense and in all the best ways, and I mean that as a compliment. Christine, thank you for joining me today. This is going to be so much fun chatting.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I always like to start the show with a fun question to kind of set the tone and get the conversation rolling. And one question that I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, that's a good one. Um, Probably like back all the way to elementary school. I w- I moved to this country when I was 5, so I was like in ESL for pretty much all of elementary school, and so it took me a very long time to learn English. But I remember one of the first things I wrote, like I think in third grade or something, was they make you write like your little like hopes and dreams on a little storybook and to like
Right.
essentially make a book about your own future. And it was like one of the first English sentences I ever remember writing, and I essentially wrote like I want to write my own books and like illustrate them or something is what I said, something to that effect. So like I feel like even long before I knew how to like function in English, I knew that like telling stories is something that like sounded like the funnest thing in the world.
Right, right. That's so funny. Did you have yeah, like for me, for instance, I remember there being a moment where in one point in time, books just seemed to be ethereal. They just came out of nowhere, you know. And then
Mhm.
there was a realization one day that some person wrote this book, and then,
Mm,
you know, if it was an illustrated book, then maybe it was a different person who did the
yeah.
illustrations, and then, you read on the back that there's a publishing company, and maybe
Mhm.
you're in a bookstore, and you realize there are people that work in this bookstore, and there's a whole chain of people that have been responsible for taking the story that existed in someone's head and going through the
Mhm.
whole process of bringing it to market, and once
Yeah.
I realized that there were people behind each step of that process, then maybe I could be one of those people. There's a realization, a dawning that goes on at some point. Was there ever a moment like that for you where books became something tangible and attainable?
A little bit. Like I remember, so maybe it's probably been like 10 years ago at this point. Like I obviously read a lot growing up and like in school and stuff, but I think somewhere between like end of high school and maybe like on my mid to late 20s, there's just like a long dry spell, like almost a decade long dry spell where I just didn't read for fun because I was so caught up doing like other stuff like going to college and grad school and like tenure track stuff. But then one day when I was at the library, like for story
Sure.
time for my toddler, I picked up an adult book just for fun. It was Junot Diaz's "This Is How You Lose Her," and I started reading, and I just realized I was like, the experience, the most concrete experience I could liken it to is like feeling like you found your soulmate, but via a book. Like it's just a very surreal experience where like it was almost like a romantic experience. Like, oh my God, I've never felt this understood, except it's a fictional character that understands me and not like a real person. And like the character in Gino Diaz's
Right.
short story is really different from me. Like they're a different gender, they're from a different like geo-ethnic location, they have very different worldviews, they're a bit of like a player and an asshole. Like they're not like me, I would hope, like overall, but just the fact their voiciness, the way they told their stories, like it just seemed like so relatable. And that was the first time I realized I remembered that like wow, like books are this living thing that you describe with many people, and they can like do a psychological like jujitsu on you, like in ways that I don't think other things in my life can. And so that reminded me that like, wow, there's people that go into this and like the thing that they create feels like it has like a life separate from its own. And that experience definitely made me want to write. And that was what inspired me to start writing like for the first time as an adult, like fiction, like not nonfiction, like for fiction for the first time. And
Right.
yeah, very relatable.
I love it. You mentioned college and grad school and
Mhm,
tenure track.
mhm.
That leads me to believe that writing fiction was not your first passion, the thing that you strove very hard for. What did you study in school, and what career path did you choose?
Yeah, so I studied psychology and Spanish literature as an undergrad at Berkeley, and then when I went on to get my PhD in social psychology. Um, but actually, writing was my first love and my first passion. I just didn't think I could make a living out of it. And even now, with the book
Mm,
deal behind me, I was like, I probably still wouldn't necessarily like rely on writing as like paying the bills just because like it's so
yeah,
unpredictable sometimes with like how long and how much time it takes. So I think I picked psychology as like my day job because I feel like what psychologists try to do and what writers try to do are very similar. Like in both cases,
right.
you're trying to understand the human experience and like make sense of it. You just do use it doing very different like techniques. But I think in the end, you're trying to like figure people out and like figure out why people do the crazy things that they do.
Yeah.
And so that's probably why like as a field, psychology really appealed to me as like a day job.
Gotcha. I love that answer, because I was one thing that I love to ask people is if your day job is different from your
Mhm.
writing career, are there any tools that you picked up in your psychology studies and
Mhm.
practice that now you bring over to the writing world? And it sounds like that it was maybe almost intentional, the
Mhm.
choosing of psychology so that it could feed your creative writing life.
Yeah, definitely. Like I think it's probably not like a one to one. So like in the
Sure.
band, for example, there's a lot of references to like real psych studies that
Right.
actually been done. Um and it's like in the footnotes and there's like a whole references section at the end if people are curious and they want to look up these studies. I'm not sure if that's something I will do like for every book I'll ever write moving forward.
Yeah.
I'll probably like write books where I don't reference any psychology studies at all just because, it's not relevant and I don't want it to become like the cliche thing that like I always do. But yeah, certainly I think the idea that, sometimes I'll read
Right.
like s- a psych study and it'll say something about or it'll reveal something about human nature and I'll think like, oh, it would be really interesting to build a whole fictional story around this idea about humanity and our quirks. So that in that sense, I think it does relate nicely.
Yeah. Do I understand that the band was born, during COVID?
Yeah, yeah. I started writing it in
Did the
I think
book,
the
The
tail
Band,
end of
come about during COVID?
yeah. I started writing it I think at the tail end of 2020. Um, and finished it before the pandemic. I mean, I,
Okay.
I don't know if the pandemic's ever really over, but yeah, I finished it within like fairly quickly during that era because we were all stuck at home, nothing better to do. um, so yeah, definitely
Right.
way to do your research.
Wa was there anything was there anything specific about that time period that brought this kind of story out?
Um, that's a good question. I mean, COVID doesn't make it explicitly into the book. But
Right.
I think one thing that COVID did like remind all of us is like it brought up like it made us confront, I think, like issues of isolation and like despair. Sounds terrible. But I mean, I think one thing the pandemic did do is like by forcing all of us inside and like away from one another, I think it did make, I think, a lot of people, not necessarily everyone, but I think a lot of people like realize just what isolation like up close looks like. And I think for a lot of people,
Right.
COVID also brought a lot of like mental health issues to light. Because of all that, I like isolation and like time away from other people. So I think those themes, I didn't do it on purpose, but I do think that like if you look at the themes in the book, like I mean, even though it's about like a K-pop boy band who like escapes to a therapist's house, I think if you look at these characters individually, they are people who feel very isolated, who feel like they don't necessarily connect with the rest of the world.
Right.
I think certainly the despair that comes with that and the mental health issues of like depression and anxiety do explicitly, get addressed in the book. So I think yeah, probably like subconsciously, those things were on my mind during COVID and sort of make cameos in the book, definitely.
Yeah. Is The Band the first, novel that you had written?
No, actually. So I had written a whole separate novel that's actually the prequel, essentially, in a way, because like the narrator and her husband in the band, I had written a whole separate novel about them prior to writing the band. And when I was
Yeah.
querying agents, I was sending out both manuscripts at the same time because I had written that one and it took so long to query that I got like tired and I wrote like the band's like in a matter of months just while waiting for people to get back to my queries. And then I realized I was like, oh, the band is a pretty good manuscript all by itself. So I was like, I'll just send them both out at the same time. And so, yeah, I got like responses to both, but the agent ended up signing with had read the band. And so that's the one we decided to go with. And my editor actually has the other book right now, the original manuscript for the like the prequel about the married couple. So we'll see what she says and whether that book will see the light of day.
Yeah, writing is this interesting art form, in
Mhm,
that um, you can have a book that you pour all of yourself into, and
mhm,
you edit it, and you get it ready, and you send it out on
mhm,
submission, and either it doesn't sell at that time for whatever reason, maybe the market's just
mhm,
not ready, or maybe you as a writer are not ready yet,
mhm,
whatever, and writers will just start over on a completely new novel and just try it
mhm,
again.
mhm,
I can think of so many other endeavors in life where if spend a year of your life working on a book and then
mhm,
send it out and no one wants it at that time, you just stop
mhm,
and just go try another artistic pursuit. But there's something about writing that just challenges the writer to just keep trying and to create all new characters, or
mhm,
all new setup. And do you ever think of that? And when you were in that process, did was there
mhm.
anything that was going through your mind that, well, I'll just I'll just keep going on another story?
Um, yeah, certainly. I mean, I like to have like multiple irons in the fire, so to speak.
Yeah,
So like I whenever I'm writing on a novel, I'm always working on a short story at the same time because I like submit those to literary magazines because I really like short stories. And I love short story collections. So I mean certainly and sometimes short stories do turn into full-length novels. So like right now,
sure.
even though like my editor has like a manuscript of mine that's like full length, like I'm still like working on multiple different like future potential projects. Like I'm working on a short story that I'm debating whether I'll turn into a novel. I'm working on something else that I'm pretty sure like can only exist in novel form and not like a short story form. So yeah, definitely. I think it's nice to like flex and exercise your creative juices by working on different projects and seeing like what comes to light, like what because I don't know, like you've talked to a lot of different authors and obviously you write yourself too. So maybe you can speak to this. Like I don't know how other people feel about this, but like I personally never know where a story's gonna go when I start it. Like I have no idea what the end game is. I don't know if you always know, like if you plot while you're writing, like your stories before you finish or before you even start writing, like feel free to chime in. But I don't know where it goes. So I need to like have different things to see which one works. I
Yeah,
don't know if you have
I'm
a
an
different experience.
I think I'm an interesting hybrid. I like to think that I don't know where the story is going to go and that
Mhm,
the possibilities are endless. I love the dynamic frustration, of that, and
mhm,
a little excitement.
mhm,
Um, but I when I if I'm honest, I kind of know where I'm going, and I'll know some points along the way. I just don't know
mhm,
how I'm gonna
mhm.
get to those points, and that's kind of what leaves
Yeah.
the tension there for me. Is I kind of know where I'm going, but I don't know how I'm gonna
Mhm.
get there, and I think that's where the excitement is for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That actually seems like the ideal way to go about it because then at least you know like what like goalposts you're gonna hit as opposed to just
Yeah.
flailing into and hoping something sticks.
That that you, I if if what you say is if you're being serious about not knowing where a book's going to go, I think I read that you wrote the band in about 3 months.
Mhm.
That's pretty quick for a story that you don't know how it's going to end.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started writing it, I just knew I wanted it to be about like this K-pop boy band who gets canceled. So I had that like basic gist in mind, and I knew I eventually wanted them to come to America. But I didn't really know like what happened afterwards. I was like, okay, this band gets canceled, and they come to like one of the members comes to America to escape to a therapist's house. Like I knew that general framework. I was like, these are things I could write about, uh, and I would have something to say. But then I was like, well, something else needs to happen, right? Like this can't just be that. There's no that's the beginning of a story. That's not like the middle or the end of a story. So I think it took me a while to like figure out exactly where the climax was going to happen and it took me a very long time to figure out the upshot. Like the upshot, I sort of like the ending. I sort of like didn't really know I was going to end it until I got there. But I think at the same time I was consuming a lot of media about like real life K-pop bands and all the drama and like the history. And I had just discovered K-pop at the same time, so I was like catching up on like years and years of like media. And because we're all stuck inside, so I'm just like on like a device constantly watching
Right.
stuff on YouTube or like googling stuff. So like I was catching up on like years of like news coverage about things that had actually happened in the K-pop world. So as I was
Right.
writing, I was consuming all this stuff, and so a lot of the inspiration did come from like real life events, not like replicas of them, but like similar things that have happened to people. Where it's like, oh, like wouldn't that be interesting if some fictionalized version inspired by that event like happened? So that's probably it was probably good that it happened during COVID and probably allowed me to write super fast because like I think on a normal like year, I probably wouldn't be consuming as much YouTube videos as I consumed during like COVID at that time.
Love it. One thing that I love about the band is there's a lot of, I mean, the whole premise of the book is very serious and very heady. Um, but you tell it in a way that there's a lot of levity in the book. Um there's a lot of time for laughter. There's a lot of time for irony. It told in a very wry and kind of sideways glancing way in a lot of times. How important is levity to you, especially when delivering a story that could have been ripped from the headlines? And we see all of these celebrity train wrecks all the time, and you know, uh, but being able to infuse some humor with that and to kind of
Yeah.
lighten the
Mhm.
emotional load sometimes is absolutely makes the story hit home.
Oh, thank you so much. That's like the biggest compliment I can hear about like my book that it's funny. That's my goal. But yeah, like I one of my favorite things to do when I'm not reading is to watch stand-up comedy. So I think, and one of my favorite things about I think contemporary comedians. I mean, I only started watching stand-up comedy maybe a few years ago, so I have no basis to judge what like historically what comedians did. But I feel like my general impression was that historically, I think I've seen like old clips of like George Carlin, for example. I feel like
Yeah,
historically, like a lot of comedians had like punchlines, like they had like one line like quips or like really short, like they're not telling you a story, they're just essentially delivering like a joke with a punchline.
right.
And I think that was like the traditional mode of like being a comedian for and again, I'm just guessing. I'm not an expert or a historian by any stretch of the imagination. But one of my favorite things about contemporary comedians, especially my favorite comedians, is one of the things I notice is that a lot of comedy specials, uh, especially like even on Netflix, for example, like they're essentially drawn out stories. Like oftentimes the comedians have like this narrative arc to their
Right.
comedy, to their stand-up special where they start with a joke and it's like it's not like a punchline with the setup. It's like a narrative story about something that actually sounds like happened to them. They might embellish it, but it sounds like a real life event. And then they have other jokes in between, but by the end of the special, they sort of circle back to that original story and like essentially like tie it all together. Where I feel like I'm
Right.
listening to like a continuous narrative, right? So I think. And a lot of these comedy specials are really powerful. Like I feel like I listen to them and I feel like I've learned more about the world or about mental
Right.
health more about discrimination or immigration. Like I feel like I learned stuff. And so I feel like that is the ideal way to tell a story. If you can make people laugh while teaching them something, to help them pay attention, because as like a college professor, I can tell you, like, if someone's bored by what you are saying, they are not going to hear anything you try to tell them. So that's why I
Right.
always want it to be like a little funny or a little lighthearted, because I want to entertain more than I want to just like prove a point, because I feel like proving a point
Right.
is pretty useless by itself. Like no one's going to remember the point if they don't remember like the funny story that went along with the point, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Well, and if they pick up a book about a K-pop boy band and then they open the cover and it's just, just being beat over the head with
Yeah.
some great cultural, meaning,
Mhm.
that they're probably not gonna finish the book, but there's probably something to be said about, endorphin release and how that goes into the, shaping your attitude about things. I don't know, I'm just guessing off the top of my head, but I think there's probably something there about, when you're happy, when you're laughing
Mhm.
about something, you feel differently about the material that brought about those feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easier to like take something seriously when you have your guard down, because I think like exactly as you described with the endorphins, like I feel like if you're
Yeah,
laughing and you're like having a generally good time, you don't have like all your walls up saying like, oh, like what is this person trying to tell me, right? Or what is this person trying to like, do they
true,
have an
true.
agenda that they're trying to like prove, right? And so I think my goal is like I usually, if there is an agenda to anything I write, it's usually like a side point. It's not the main goal of the story. And so I usually want people to like let their guard down and be like, huh, that's interesting. Like, let's see where the story takes us. And if there is something I can learn from what happened in the story, all the better. But that's not the front and center goal. And I think people like are
Right.
probably hopefully more open to stories that sound like that as opposed to. And I personally, when I read, and I've like even written about this. Like I've written entire essays about like the peeves I have as a reader. And I think like one of my
Mhm.
pet peeves is when I read, oftentimes even a story I really like that I think is super important, that I think needs to be told. But sometimes if it's told in a very pedantic kind of voice, where they're trying to like they make it like an explicit point about like
Right.
patriarchy or sexism or racism or whatever other isms that the author disagrees with,
Right.
a little too explicit about it, it just like it actually I find it very distracting. And I'm like, okay, now I'm just thinking about like your ideology. I'm not really thinking about your story. I'm thinking like, oh, like, yeah, I'm sure all these isms are bad, but that's not the point of the story. So I personally get distracted by that as a reader. So I try to avoid that whenever possible when I'm writing.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned earlier that you love to write short stories. And one of my all-time favorite short story writers and was Ray Bradbury, and he wrote a
Oh,
ton of short stories, and he used to give advice to new writers, and he would say, write a short story every week. And by the end of a year, surely you can't write 50 bad short stories in a row, which is kind of tongue in cheek, um, but there's something about exercising those muscles, and then once you've, attained the form of the short story, then move to a novel. And, that doesn't hold true for everyone. Some people, write novels first and they're just good at it and, you know, aren't very good at the shorter structure of a short story. That's beside the point. But what is it about the form of the short story that you like the most as a
oh, that's a great
writer?
question. I love Ray Bradbury too, but I had never heard that quote, that advice. But I love it, and I wonder if I should practice it more about writing more short stories. I think the thing that appeals to me the most about short stories is the shorter length forces them to get to the point faster and not waste time with words. And I confess, this is not something I endorse, but this is just my personal confession as a reader that sometimes,
Yeah.
frequently, when I read a novel, even if it's a novel I love, I will skim through. Like if there's long sections just describing the setting, I will just skim through it because I don't know. maybe I'm just not a romantic person. Like I don't care how beautiful, and I've read a lot of books with beautiful descriptions of setting. I just don't care. I'm like, unless it's like in a foreign, like if it's a foreign country that I really want to visit, maybe I'll pay attention. Or if it's like an alien universe and I have no idea how to ground myself and I need to figure out what the setting
Yeah.
is so I can figure out the story, I'll pay attention. But like if it's just some city in America that I either have been to already or don't care about, I'm like, I'll just skim through a lot of the setting, a lot of like, I care about dialogue, I care about action. Sometimes I care about backstory, but like if the backstory is not super exciting, I don't care about that either. So I sound like an awful reader, but
Right.
that's the thing that drives me like up the wall about novels when there's like when I pick up a thick novel and I read it and I enjoy it, but I'm like, this novel could be 30% shorter if you just cut out all the boring stuff. I think a short story
Right.
doesn't set you up for that kind of um, I don't want to call it like fat, but yeah, a little bit like literary like fluff that is
Yeah.
interesting and good. And people certainly, I'm sure there are readers who enjoy that fluff. I'm just personally not one of them. It's probably why my book is so darn short because I'm just like I don't really care too much about like ever. The book is set in LA, so I'm like you either have a stereotype about LA or you've lived in LA. So I'm like you don't need me to describe LA to you that much other than the parts that are super relevant to the story, right? So that's part of the appeal. Like I'm too impatient to get through like long stretches of novel where nothing
Right.
is happening.
Right. Do you have
Especially,
a right?
sorry, go ahead.
Do you have a method? Do you have a method for writing short stories? Do you begin or do you approach them in the same way that you approach a novel? I guess what I'm asking is, do you see the structure of the short story differently than you see the structure of the novel?
That's a great question. Um, I actually think I was recently like debating this because I was like, now that I edit short stories for literary magazines, I find that it drives me up a wall that short stories don't have more plot. So actually now when I write short stories, I'm much
Mm,
more intentional, thinking to see like figuring out particularly by the end of a short story or close to the end whether there is a plot. And I used to never think about that. Like before originally when I wrote stories, I would just start writing similar to the way I write a novel and I'll just end it where I feel like it needs to end. But I don't necessarily go back and think like, is there enough plot in this short story to warrant it being told in the first place? But I think now my approach to short stories and novels is actually much more similar than it used to be because having read a lot of short stories that get submitted to literary magazines, I'm like, wow, most of these don't have any discernible plot to speak of. And it drives the reader away because I'm like, nothing's happening. Like, and I know like Raymond Carver type short stories, nothing happens, and they're still great. But like, I feel like most short stories, and also, Raymond Carver is not like he's not like putting out short stories now. So we may also want to
right.
move beyond like the Carver model of like snapshots of life. Um, so yeah, I think now my approach is actually super similar. I start writing, I don't know where it's going to go, but by the end, I look back and I try to look for the plot. And if there's no plot, I keep on tinkering until I feel like there's sufficient plot to ground the story. Do you
Yeah.
write short stories?
Well,
I
if
feel
you're
like
gonna write a short story, I'm sorry?
I was going to just ask, do you write short stories too? Um, or do you primarily write novels?
I do. I do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I both. I love short stories in that, like you said, you can get to the point. You can
Mhm.
drop in, and I also one of the things that I love about short stories is the fact that you don't have to wrap them up in a
Mhm.
pretty little bow at the end. You can
Yes,
there's a
exactly.
lot of things you can kind of leave to the reader's imagination in the short story, and I kind of like that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Short stories all
Yeah,
tend to have like open-ended endings. And honestly, I'm surprised not more novels
right,
don't have open-ended endings. Like, I feel like a lot of stories don't just end with like a climax and then that's it. um,
right,
yeah,
right.
I agree.
Well, yeah, we can hope that the industry will come around to our point of view one day, I guess. But
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, well, the band is out available everywhere now. Christine Ma-Kellams, I love this book. I'm recommending it to everyone. If folks are just discovering you and your work, is there a good place for them to find you online and dig into all the great stuff you're up to?
Yeah, I'm on all the major socials. So I'm on like Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I'm on Facebook too, but it's just like my personal page, so I don't post a lot of author stuff on there. And then I have my website, which is just my name, like christinema-kellams.com, and that links to everything. And pretty much everything I've ever written is on that website too. So yeah, all that stuff is online.
Excellent. We will link up a link to the book and to your website and all that good stuff in the show notes of this episode and make it easier for folks to find you. Christine, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.